也怪那边被被跳到，切切被过一万
A challenge into a duel, a wisdom duel. These are testing
Welcome to Wisdom Duels.
So let's begin. So today our topic for debate is mind wandering. And first question I have for you is, can you posit the primary conceptions that are talked about in the contemporary literature with regard to mind wandering?
Yes, I accept.
Okay, please posit them.
So there is primarily two conceptions of mind wandering. So definition in terms of its, I guess, content, which is task unrelated thinking. So distinguishing task unrelated thinking as mind wandering and task related thinking as goal directed, not mind wandering. And there is the dynamic framework, which defines mind wandering in terms of constraints on the dynamics of the thought. So mind wandering would be unconstrained thought, and not mind wandering would be constrained kinds of thought, or maybe mind wandering would be relatively less constrained thought, and non-mind wandering would be more constrained thought.
Okay, so take the subject, task unrelated thinking, defined in terms of the contents of a thought, and dynamic framework of mind wandering defined in terms of more or less constraints on thought. Follows those are the two primary frameworks or conceptions of mind wandering.
I accept.
Okay, so let's go and jump into this idea of the dynamic framework where we're talking about more or less constrained thinking.
And actually, maybe just to mess this up a little bit, but
Sure.
for simplicity, just as a meta comment, we are ignoring here several other distinctions in the literature just to keep the discussion a bit simple, namely distinctions between intentional and unintentional mind wandering or thought, and stimulus versus stimulus dependent versus stimulus independent thought. So another way to define mind wandering might be stimulus independent thought, but for now we'll just stick with the two.
Perfect, thank you. So there actually are more than just two conceptions. Good to point out. So those are two of several, and let's for now.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I have a question.
Yes, please.
So can any spontaneous thought be considered mind wandering? Just to put it in a single term. Any spontaneous thought.
So let's get into it. Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of bring that into. That will come out in the next minute or two when we go into what a constraint really is about. And good question. So let's then look at this idea of constraints on thought. So take the subject constraint. It follows a constraint on thought. It follows that you can posit a definition of it.
I accept.
Okay. What is it? Positive.
So a constraint is a sustained topical focus or direction on the thoughts.
Okay, take the subject, a sustained, you said?
Yeah,
sustained topical focus or?
Direction on the thoughts.
Or direction of thought. Take the subject, a sustained topical focus or a direction on the thought. It follows that is the definition of a constraint on a thought.
I accept.
Okay, and it follows you can posit the different types of constraints.
I accept.
What are they?
So they're deliberate or top-down constraints and automatic or bottom-up constraints.
Okay, so take the subject, deliberate or top-down constraints and automatic or bottom-up constraints. It follows those are the different types of constraint.
I accept.
And now I'll take the subject, constraints on content and constraints on transition. It follows that is also a way of dividing or categorizing constraints.
I accept.
Okay, so can you describe what those are about?
Yeah, so a constraint on the content of the thought is a constraint that influences, well, the content of the thought, and a constraint on the transition is a constraint that determines how we move from one thought to the next.
Okay, so now take those two. Take A, constraint on content of thought, and B, constraint on the transition of thought. It follows that you can posit the joints, either 3 joints, 4 joints, contradiction, or equivalence.
I accept.
Okay, what is it? How many?
So I think it is equivalence.
Equivalence.
Yeah.
Okay, so it follows that if something is a constraint on content of thought, it's necessarily a constraint on transition of thought.
I accept.
Take the subject, anger. It follows that it is a constraint.
I accept.
It follows it is a constraint on content of thought.
I accept.
It follows it is not a constraint on content of thought because it is not a determiner of the direction of a thought.
Why?
It follows it is a determiner of the direction of thought.
I accept.
It is because?
It's a determiner of the direction of thought because when one is in an angry state, the thoughts automatically follow each other, like the thoughts, for example, of how I have been mistreated and I feel wronged. And it's very difficult to, in fact, get out of that angry process and see another perspective.
So your reason is that it's so given the predicate that anger is a constraint which determines the direction of thought, the reason is because it causes the succeeding mental states to basically go around a similar realm of contents.
Yeah, from angry thought to angry thought, basically.
From angry thought to angry thought. So if a thought or if a mental state or psychological construct causes the succeeding moments of thought to go from angry state to angry state, it follows it is necessarily a constraint on the contents of thought. Or sorry, it follows necessarily a constraint which determines the direction of thought.
I accept.
And if it is that kind of thought which causes the succeeding thoughts to go from anger to anger, it follows it is necessarily a constraint on the contents of thought.
I accept.
So take the subject, the transition of moments of conscious experience from anger to anger. It follows that that is content of thought.
That is our content of thought. Why?
It follows it is not content of thought.
I accept.
It follows it is transition of thought.
I accept.
So take the subject anger. It follows it does not determine the contents of a thought.
Why?
Because it determines the transition of thought and does not determine the actual object with which the thought is engaged. So take the subject. Take this subject. Right, take this subject. Oh, let's say one's boss. It follows that it is it and the contents of anger share a common locus.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Take the subject one's boss.
Uh-huh.
It follows that it and the contents of anger share a common locus, a common basis, which is both of them. In other words, that there exists anger which has one's boss as its contents.
I guess could be, possibly, not necessarily.
Right, but so take the subject anger towards one's boss. It follows it is anger which has one's boss as its content.
I accept.
So take that anger. It follows that its contents are determined by itself, by the anger itself.
I accept.
So take the subject anger. It follows that, if something is anger, it necessarily has one's boss as its content.
Why?
Can you give an example?
Well, so there can be anger at one's president in the United States.
Right.
Which,
so anger at one's president. At the president of the
anger not directed at one's
right.
boss. Most of
so
it.
If take the subject anger at the president, it follows that its contents are determined by the anger itself.
I accept.
And it is because?
It is because so the content of the that's actually a good question. The content of the anger depends on the previous moment of anger, and therefore
so take the subject, the first moment of anger at the president, president of the United States. It follows that the contents of that are not determined by the anger.
I accept.
So it follows that there is no determinant of the contents of that anger.
Why?
Okay, posit something.
So it can be the actual an action of that person that determines the arising of the anger, the first moment of that anger.
Okay, so if something is a cause of that first moment of the anger at the president, it follows it is necessarily a determinant of the contents of it.
I accept.
Okay, so if take the subject cause of thought and constraint on thought, it follows they are equivalent. A, cause of a thought. B, constraint on a thought. Follows they are equivalent.
Why?
Okay, it follows they are not equivalent.
I accept.
So if something is a constraint on thought, it follows it is not necessarily. I'm sorry. If something is a cause of thought, it follows it is not necessarily a constraint on thought.
Why?
So it follows that if something is a cause of thought, it is necessarily a constraint on thought, but if something is a constraint on thought, it is not necessarily a cause of the thought.
I accept.
Okay. And I guess you would posit something which occurs simultaneously with with it.
Yeah, or it can be.
Okay, go ahead. Posit.
It can be any factor that's simultaneous with that thought. So, for example, a constraint on a thought can be driven by the location environment in which you currently are. It can be the activation of a set of memories that you currently have available. So there's many constraints of thoughts.
So take the subject, the first moment of anger at the President of the United States, it follows that if something is a constraint on that, it is necessarily a cause of it.
The first moment, necessarily a cause of it. Why?
It follows it is not necessarily a cause of it.
I accept.
Okay, let's have an example.
So, okay, so the I guess that could be just it. That's so the constraint on the arising of anger can be just an individual's arousal level that determines like the propensity for the anger to arise, which is not necessarily directly related to the actions of a person. It can
Okay,
be
so
other mental makeup factors.
so take that subject, those other mental makeup factors, it follows that they are not a cause of anger, of that first moment of anger.
I accept.
It follows they are a cause of it because they precede it in time and are necessary for its arising.
I guess I have to accept that one. Yeah.
So it follows they are a cause
Yeah.
of that moment, first moment.
Yeah, I guess I would phrase it more in terms of like a facilitating factor, but yeah, I guess that's also a cause. So yeah.
So take the subject, a facilitating factor of the first moment of anger, an influence on the first moment of anger, something which affects the first moment of anger, a constraint on the first moment of anger. It follows those are all equivalent.
I accept.
Okay, so it follows that, so take the subject A, constraint on thought, and B, cause of thought. It follows they are equivalent.
Why?
Because constraint on the first moment of anger and the cause of first moment of anger are equivalent, then they're totally analogous situations. Thought in general and the first moment of anger are analogous.
No pervasion.
Well, they're analogous means that the reason would apply in the same way to both situations.
Yeah, but not to all situations, right? So we're talking about specific example of that first moment of anger, but doesn't necessarily mean that all the constraints possible would necessarily be a cause for.
So the situations aren't analogous, basically. You're saying really.
Yeah.
So the first moment of anger. So that reason that the situation of thought in general and the first moment of anger are analogous would not be established. Right. The reason is not established.
Yeah.
So then it follows you can posit a thought for which constraints on it and causes of it are not equivalent. The instance of thought.
I accept.
Okay. Let's have it.
Yeah, I guess I still go with the No, I guess I have to retract this. Yeah, I guess it's my confusion between whether something is a collaborating cause or a sufficient cause for something to arise, right? So they will.
Sure, yeah. But they're both causes, right?
Yeah, true.
Okay. Okay, so take the subject A, cause of thought, and B, constraint of thought. It follows that they are equivalent. And then
yeah.
Thought. Okay. So there's one side, and then let's kind of back out again because we don't want to spend all of our time on this one question. So we have basically constraint on content, constraint on transitions, and those are also equivalent, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so interesting. And then now we have this, so Shilpi's question, maybe we can really bring that one in more. So when we're talking about mind wandering, then it follows that in this dynamic framework that it would be dependent, identifying a thought as mind wandering would be dependent on the degree of constraint that is there for it.
I accept.
Mm-hmm. So it follows that, so take the subject spontaneous thought, it follows that it exists.
I accept.
Okay, so it takes spontaneous thought, it follows that it is maximally unconstrained thought.
Ooh. Why?
Mm-hmm. It follows it is not maximally unconstrained thought.
I accept.
It follows if I'll start using the proper language, which I forgot to use before. If follows if X is maximally unconstrained thought, it is necessarily a dream or thought in a dream.
I guess I accept.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
actually maybe not. Sorry, why?
Okay, let's hear an example for something which is maximally unconstrained but not a dream thought.
Yeah, so the best example, the most unconstrained example I can think of is a psychedelic experience.
Oh, okay.
That one is a bit more unconstrained than dreams, but I'm not an
more
expert
unconstrained
matter.
So are you talking about, would that be a thought, or are you not distinguishing thought and other types of sensory perception?
I would say that that's still the mental experience. So that would be the.
Okay. So you're talking about a mental experience under the influence of a psychedelic substance.
Or the thought process under a psychedelic.
Those thought processes.
Yeah. So I
follows that those are as equally unconstrained as dreams, but not constrained. Less constrained. Sorry, equally as unconstrained as dreams and less constrained than spontaneous thought that occurs without the influence of that substance.
Well, so I would say that maybe why? What I was trying to say was actually the psychedelic experience was more unconstrained than the dreams. But Stefan.
Even more unconstrained than a dream. Okay.
Yeah.
But it is okay. So it follows that it is even more maximally. It is ultra maximally unconstrained.
That's why I was not willing to accept the point that dreams were maximally unconstrained.
Yeah.
I was thinking that there was something more. But Stefan actually raises his hand. So.
Yes, thank you.
Please.
Thought maybe it would be fruitful to bring in the notion of coherence in here.
Okay.
Constraints maybe guarantee some sort of coherence, and if there are no constraints at all, then my experience might be pretty incoherent, like in a psychedelic experience. And maybe dreams have some constraints, maybe just the previous state or the previous 2 minutes or so in a dream might be constraining, but there might be some constraints, and therefore dreams might be coherent to some degree.
So let's go with that. And so take the subject coherence, which I'm hearing in the way you're talking about it, Stefan, sort of intending a sort of sequence of thoughts over time that have some sort of connection between them in terms of their content. Is that basically what you're referring to as coherence?
Yes. So I'm not basing this on literature in mind wandering. I'm not too grounded in that, but that just would be the idea. Yeah, that there is some connecting element or some connecting content between those moments in time, as you say.
And would it also relate? Well, I'll start asking Yeah, so I'll take your questions and bring them to America and see how it goes. Okay, America. So let's resume, and see. That's a good way to go. Okay, cool. So we established that a cause of a thought and a constraint on that thought are equivalent, which means that. So I'm actually just going to say take maximally unconstrained thought. Just the generality. Take that subject. It follows that it is a constrained thought.
Maximally constrained. I accept.
Right. So even though it's maximally unconstrained, that maximal lack of constraint must be posited in relation to relatively more constrained, but not to say that it's absent of constraints.
I accept.
And is that and the reason is because it's not absent of causes.
I accept.
Okay. So then what is the next thing we have to figure out is what distinguishes either this thinking process under the influence of psychedelics or a dream, which are more unconstrained than. Well, actually, first, let me ask you to posit something. Can you posit an example of something which is relatively more constrained thought than a dream or a psychedelic experience?
I accept.
Okay, let's have an example.
So that would be goal-directed performance of
goal-directed performance of a task.
Yeah.
Generally, okay. Take the subject. And performance, is that thought? Take that subject. Goal-directed performance of a task.
I guess goal-directed engagement in a task. So
conceptual engagement. Goal-directed. I mean, to make it clear that we're talking about thought as opposed to.
So maybe we'd say the planning process for performing.
The planning process.
A specific task.
Take the subject, the planning process for performing a specific task. It follows that is relatively more constrained than a dream.
Yeah, I accept.
Of a dream. Okay, so it follows it is not. So I'm getting into Stefan's point here. It follows that it is not more constrained than a dream because it does not have more causes than the dream thought.
Why?
It follows it does not have more causes than the dream thought because it has an equal array of quite likely countless numbers of causes.
Why?
It follows that those two, so take the subject, the thought of a dream, and the planning process of a goal-directed task. It follows that they do not have an equal array of countless causes.
I accept.
So it follows you can posit a countable number of causes for either one of them.
I accept.
Okay, so can you posit that?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I'm going to be exhaustive, but so for example, for the dream, there would be very limited number of causes present. So it would probably depend on one's experiences during the day, the level of acetylcholine, which determines whether one is in the dream state, and therefore also is thought to determine the strength of associations. And that would probably be, and also any past experiences, those would probably be the determinants of the dream. Now, for the planning process of the task, that would be caused by the whole set of processes of that determine the task. It would be determined by I guess the content of, or the amount of goal-directed cognitive capacity. It would be determined also by the memories, previous memories of that particular task, as well as probably any prior experiences related to that task and related to other not task related things, so you know what to plan and what not to plan. So I think I've already accumulated more causes than for the dreams.
Yeah, well, you said an entire array of the cognitive process, not cognitive processes. You said the entire array of, what did you say again? Some processes that
Past experience.
determine the task. Oh, okay, you said that too. You said it, yeah. And so past experience. So then, so that's an entire array of causes, right? So then take the subject, the experiences of the day which influence the dream. It follows that that is also a large array of phenomena.
I accept.
And it follows the experiences during the day have causes.
I accept.
Okay, so it follows that the experiences of yesterday are causes of the experiences of today.
I accept.
Okay, and it follows that the objects of the environment, which were the basis for the perceptions of today's experiences, also cause today's experiences.
I accept.
So it follows when we consider all of this together and go back, chronologically ad infinitum, that we end up with a countless array of causes.
Right, I accept.
Okay, so it follows that. So that's okay, right? So there's a countless array of causes.
Yeah.
For the dream as well as for the goal-directed thought, right? It follows that there is a countless array of causes for both.
Yeah, I have to accept that. Yeah, I think what went
so
wrong.
Then there's some other distinction. So now let's go into this notion of, so you selected certain types of certain types of causes for the goal-directed thinking, which were not present for the dream thinking. Can you posit specifically what causes would be present for the goal-directed thinking, which are not present in the dream thinking?
Yeah, well, so what I would say is, not sure whether they fit in the language of this question, but basically the difference between the goal-directed thinking and the dream thinking is that the goal-directed thinking is more deterministic, so that for any particular transition, like if you ask 4 different people or 10 different people to perform that task, then that every person will roughly follow these same planning stages. Whereas for the dream, if you ask the same number of people to dream, every person will have a different sequence of thoughts that comprise the dreams. So it's the task that constrains it more.
Take the subject. Okay. The constraint on the goal-directed thought, which is the nature of the task itself. It follows that that is the distinguishing feature of the goal-directed thought and the dream thought.
I accept.
Mm-hmm. So it follows that if there is a task it follows that if X is a thought that has an associated task, it is necessarily constrained in the way of a goal-directed, in this way of a goal-directed thought.
Well, sorry, can you repeat that once again?
Well, so take the subject, the dream thought, it follows it has no task associated with it.
I accept.
Okay, so if something is a thought with a task associated with it, it follows it is necessarily at this higher level of constraint that we're now discussing with the task-related thought.
I accept.
Mm-hmm. So take the subject, make sure my mic is still, my recorder is still going. Okay. Sometimes they have a limit. I'm sorry. I think this one doesn't seem to. Okay, so take the subject, right? So let me put it this way. So it follows that if something is at this level of constraint, which we're talking about, if X is a thought at this level of constraint, which we're now discussing, it is necessarily not an instance of mind wandering.
I accept.
Okay, so it follows if X is a thought which has a related task, it is necessarily not mind-wandering.
I accept.
So take the subject,
Good. Here.
right? The thoughts of that are together with excitement and desire with the contents of, playing ball that occur at the time of one sitting in class. It follows that that is not mind-wandering.
Why?
It is not mind-wandering because it is task-associated thinking. It's thoughts that have associated tasks. Precise phrasing.
Associated task. No pervasion.
Oh, so it follows if if X is a thought which has an associated task, it is not necessarily not mind-wandering.
Exactly. Accept.
Okay, so you saw you reversed that position, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay, so there is some. Oh, speak. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to bring in the concept of primary and secondary tasks here. Usually in mind wandering literature, the mind wandering is described to be something that is not related to the primary task. That you either ask the participant to perform, or the participant himself or herself decides on that, okay, this is the task that I'm doing.
Awesome, right? So that's a very important distinction. So it follows that for any, sort of, I don't know, how would you say this? So it follows that there are both primary tasks and secondary tasks.
Well, so I would call them focal task and non-focal task, because primary and secondary implies there are only two, but maybe there's one focal and more than one.
Subsidiary, maybe, yeah. However,
with that caveat, I will accept.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm glad you made it right. I realized that. I guess I didn't take that from Shopi's phrasing, but I see how it could be taken that way. So, okay, so focal and non-focal, but I think non-focal is strange because then it implies that it's not focused, which it could be, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to imply that, but
well, it is. I guess you could be focusing on the non-focal task. Yeah.
So take the for instance, take the subject, a person sitting in class. It follows a person sitting in neuroscience class. It follows, it follows that they are, it follows that they have both focal and non-focal tasks.
Why?
It follows they have both focal and non-focal tasks because they have, because they have a task, because when you, I'll just say how Shopi said it, because when they are questioned about their tasks, they are able to express one focal task, for instance, learning neuroscience, and a separate task, for instance, getting exercise and hanging out with your friends and playing ball later in the day.
The reason's not established because they might not necessarily have always the two tasks. I mean, sometimes they might have just one focal task, and sometimes they might have a focal and a non-focal task, depending on whether they are.
So take the subject, a human, it follows that they have no hands.
Why?
because they might have hands and they might not have hands.
Except.
So normally this is just a logical, I guess you could say it's a feature of Tibetan and Nalanda tradition, Indian logic, where if something exists in one instance, then we just say that it exists, right? If it can be found in one person, then we say it exists in people, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that a person is necessarily thinking at this moment always about, you know, playing ball. But anyway, so my point being, so just going back, so, you know, so when I ask there are focal tasks and non-focal tasks, that just means that does there exist a person for whom, when they're asked, they say, my main task is paying attention and learning neuroscience, but I'm also wanting to go play ball.
I accept.
Okay. So, and it follows that that person's focal, that very person, they're the subject. It follows that the distinction of their focal task and non-focal task is simply dependent on what is more or less desired by them to be focused on.
It's really hard, I would say. Why? Because it comes to very deep questions about, you know, what is it desired at what level? I mean, on the short term or on the long term?
So this is where we're getting, like, what is a focal, we're going into what is really the focal task mean and who determines it, right? And what, you know, or what subtle mental process determines it if it's not like the whole of the person. But so okay, so why? So it follows that that isn't what determines it, the focal and the distinction between focal and non-focal tasks.
I guess I accept.
Oh, there is nothing which distinguishes it.
There is nothing which distinguishes it. Why?
Okay, positive thing that distinguishes. As it, on what basis would you make that distinction?
The focal, I would make it on the basis of I would make it on the basis of the amount of, oh, that's also tricky. I would almost say in the predominant goal determined by the social situation. Maybe that's the...
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So take the subject, the predominant goal based on the social situation of some person. It follows that that is the primary, you know, metric to use to distinguish between a focal and a non-focal task.
Yeah, I accept.
So take the subject. Okay, we're gonna bring in some spiritual practice here because it's also things that actually happen in people's minds, right? So take the subject, a person intent on developing their mind to have you know, infinite compassion and be free from destructive emotions, right? In other words, someone with the bodhicitta, right? And so it follows that that follows that they have a primary task.
I accept. Or you mean focal task here, or primary? You mean primary and focal task? Yeah, focal. Okay.
Yeah, I switched the wording back. Sorry. Focal, yeah. But I mean, I'm thinking of them synonymously, but maybe we'll just leave that phrasing behind.
Just
so
to be...
they have a focal task. So take that person. It follows. So take that person sitting in neuroscience class. It follows that they have a focal task.
I accept.
Take the subject. The attainment of this sort of highly evolved emotional maturity and you know, freedom from mental difficulties and destructive mental states. It follows that that is their focal task.
Why?
It follows it is their focal task because it is the task which in the social situation. How did you phrase it again? The
Determined
the
by
thing
the social
determined by
situation.
just determined by the social situation.
Because the reason's not established.
It follows it is not the main task determined by their social situation.
I accept.
It's not because?
It's not because the main task determined by the social situation in the neuroscience class is paying attention to the neuroscience class.
Okay. Now take that same person in, let's say, a Tibetan college studying the neuroscience class. It follows that that follows that the achievement of this evolved mental state is that person's focal task.
We'd have to ask that person, but let's say I accept.
So just just to ask, so is it this social context is different, you're saying, because of what the wider culture or society sees fit as a task, basically?
Yeah, I accept.
Simply put. Okay. So if that's the case, then how does that relate back to mind wandering? I know we're getting low on time, so that's an interesting path to pursue. But basically, if we accept that that's what determines a focal task versus a non-focal task, and the presence or absence of mind wandering is to be determined whether the thought is directed towards the focal task or not. I mean, again, we're using that dynamic framework, which is defining in terms of constrained, more or less constrained thought, but the way you determined a higher level of constraint was based on task-related thinking.
Yeah.
So then really it comes down to a task-unrelated thought as being the primary, or we would say focal task-unrelated thought.
Right, but at least it's just one primary. Like, you can imagine that might be other levels of constraints as well, but we've just zoomed in on the task relatedness as one dimension, which I think is also one that's made in the literature. So you can imagine that there's other constraints. And
so let me just ask quickly before we finish. Curious, so it follows that there exists a state, or I should say a time period, where for a certain person there is no mind wandering.
Try to oversee the consequences of accepting that statement. I accept. Yeah.
And so it follows that, for instance, a person in neuroscience class, so take the subject of person in neuroscience class, it follows that they have, now I'm talking about an ordinary untrained person, untrained in specific, I guess you could say, contemplative techniques for developing concentration. This kind of person in neuroscience class, it follows that they have periods without mind wandering.
I accept.
It follows that they have periods where the mind is single-pointedly focused on their subject.
I accept.
So it follows that those single-pointedly focused thoughts, take that subject, the single-pointedly focused thoughts on neuroscience in the mental continuum of that person, it follows that they are maximally constrained.
Yeah, you can see where you're going with this. I would say why.
It follows they're maximally constrained because they are focused on a focal task. They're directed at a focal task, and they are the continuum of that focus is maintained over time without being lost to other foci, which so they're contained. Yeah, put it that way. They're contained, so thus they're constrained. Maximally contained
Mhm.
The reason.
I would say reasons not established because
Mm-hmm.
the being focused on it. Well, actually, maybe it's no pervasion, right? Because reason being focused on a task does constrain thoughts, but maybe not to the maximum level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it follows there is a level beyond that of constraint, beyond being single-pointedly focused on a single object or a single focus.
I accept.
Okay. Would you? Yeah, go ahead and posit it.
Yeah, so I guess you can be constrained. Well, so the person who is focused on the task, but at the same time also has some psychopathology that makes their mind more rigid, they would be more constrained than than another person who has the ADHD and is still maybe for a little while focusing on the.
So it would involve some sort of rumination that maybe is maladaptive and not really productive for the person.
Yeah.
But
Or it
that's
can
an extra
sometimes
level of
also be
constraint.
productive. So there's some evidence actually that people who are suffering from depression, that they do sometimes better at sticking and zooming in, or especially actually people with autism. That's a better example, which are also mentioned in the paper we read, where they can zoom in better on the task than your average person.
Okay.
And at the same time, maybe they are also focused on more thoughts than, I don't know. Anyway.
So I'm just gonna ask, I think we need to finish up quickly, but so take the subject, the person and the ordinary untrained person in neuroscience class, and so a dual subject, that person A, and B, a trained contemplative who is dwelling in single pointed samadhi, say focused on the image of a Buddha. So it follows that their sort of thoughts or their sort of cognitive engagement with with the contents of those thoughts are equally constrained.
Why?
Okay, it follows they're not equally constrained.
I accept.
They're not because?
They are not equally constrained because the untrained person is likely to have a lower level of metacognition than the trained person, and the metacognition would allow the trained person to more consciously direct their thoughts in another direction.
And with the untrained person with lacking that, so take that subject, the untrained person, so take that subject, the metacognition, it follows that that is an added constraint for thought.
I guess I accept. Yeah. In the sense that it is an added determinant of the thought process. Yeah.
So it follows that that metacognition and constrained thinking are, what's the word? Sort of related, such that the greater degree of one affects the degree of the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I accept.
Or the greater degree of the metacognition at least affects the constraint. Yeah. Okay, I think we're running out of time, right? So maybe
so
any
maybe
last thoughts we can end with.
I mean, so I guess maybe it's nice to give a brief summary. So what we talked about, just for the purposes of the recording, so we talked about what is the definition of mind wandering, and then we went into causes versus constraints and how those are different or the same, and we talked about differences and similarities between whether constraints are only on the content or on the transitions. And then we talked a little bit about how goal-directedness and focus, how that was related to mind wandering. And then we talked a little bit about the effects of meditation and how that would meditation training, and also actually the motivation of bodhicitta and those kind of things, how that would affect the level of constraint of one's thoughts. I guess those are all topics that came up in our trying to figure out what we mean by mind wandering and also constraints on mind wandering. And I think that for me, the learning moment was like actually realizing that constraints and causes of thoughts must be equivalent. And I think last time what I learned was actually the anything that's a constraint on a thought, on the content of a thought, is probably also a constraint on the transition between thoughts. That's why I changed my position compared to last week. I was thinking about it for a little bit more. So yeah.
Right, and you also changed the way you defined a constraint on a thought, which sort of threw me off at first, but ended up leading to the same conclusion anyway, because I wasn't really sure what the direction of a thought sort of implied, but it seems like basically anything that influenced, which is how you worded it last time, just something that influence that affects the thought kind of ends up being a similar thing. And so then, and Shilpi added the question, a couple questions about the sort of spontaneous thought, which we didn't fully unpack, and then Stefan also this idea of coherence, which seemed quite important in this context. It seemed to have something there, but I guess it's really, Marika went more in the direction of focusing on the task itself, that is like the main differentiating feature of the more or less constraint.
Yeah. But we can talk about the spontaneity, for example, some other time. So
yeah. We can
or I think the meditation is, I think, also a really interesting topic to focus on more.
Right. Me too.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you guys, do you have any questions or comments or anything you want to prepare for next time?
Not really, but I would like to talk about the spontaneity and goal-directedness when it comes to mind wandering.
Okay.
I had 2 questions, and one was Marike answered already. One was what she has learned from this debate, because she was attacked with a lot of great questions, and I thought that might have changed some positions, but I guess Marike answered that already. And the second question would have been also in the interest of the recording, Donio, what previous knowledge did you have about mind wandering before? What did you bring in?
Oh, I actually just read a couple of the papers that Marika sent me recently that were, oh yeah, there we go. So there was 2 papers listed there. I mean, the names of the papers aren't listed, but the author Christoph for the dynamic framework, and then I guess, was it Irving who did this?
No, there was another
was also
Paul Selly. So there was a debate between Paul Selly and Kalina Christoph, which was also, we talked about a little bit before this session. And then I added actually some other notes to this outline that was made by Donio about this. So yeah, and actually what we started the debate with, maybe also for the benefit of the recording, interesting to mention, is we originally started with a paper that I kind of wanted to read, which is about the dynamics of mind wandering and its relation to flexibility, fixation, and creativity. So that's this preprint that you can now see on the screen. So, and there we came up with these questions about constraints and stuff like that, and relation to creativity, and then dynamic framework of thought. And then, we all read that, and as well as the Kalina Christoph Nature Reviews Neuroscience paper on this topic. And then, so based on that is sort of how our discussion evolved over the weeks.
Yeah, and it's continuing to evolve. And I think for my own understanding of mind wandering, and one of the things that seems to me to be a cause of this particular construct's sort of the convoluting nature of so many different perspectives, is because it's really so deeply grounded in common experience. And so, of course, I'm an expert in mind wandering because of my own experience of it in that sense. And and it seems like, since I have this the understanding of my training of Indian psychology, and then tradition / Tibetan Buddhist psychology, this, which really has a whole different way of conceiving mind in general, and I mean in several ways, but basically we have this sense of sort of, base mind that comes together with sort of facets, mental facets, which each have their own function. And in this context, we would understand something like mind wandering as a mental facet that can accompany sort of a base mind, and a mind meaning just, say, for instance, the thought of, focusing on a lecturer and the teacher, the thought of anger at the president, any of these things are mind, right? So that would be the understanding of that there's certain mental facets which can have a function. So mind wandering, which is more or less not a bad translation for the Tibetan term jini, and that would simply be something that takes the mind off of its, like pretty much how we were talking about it, off of its focal, object, we would call it, but the focal task, which is posited in relation to, what an individual really is intending to focus, or has a deeper intention to focus on, or a sort of conceived intention to focus on. And so something that distracts, the attention away from that object and brings it towards sort of maladaptive thinking processes that involve destructive emotion and sort of those kinds of unrealistic thinking. We call afflictions, but I know that's not I don't really know where to fit that term into, the contemporary cognitive science framework. But anyway.
Yeah, although I guess, so that's also another interesting thing to talk about. So where the Tibetan Buddhist emotion phenomenology is really classified along a moral conception, I guess the Western emotion conception is more along hedonistic dimensions, like whether they're pleasant or unpleasant.
And it's not necessarily moral as much as it is effective, I think. So it's more like what are the results in terms of, it comes close to hedonistic, but it's really in terms of the sort of degree of peace of the mind, degree of sort of sort of experiential peace, which is kind of a hedonistic value, right? And then also in terms of the actual, this is the thing that's the bigger difference, is that in terms of the correctness, simply put, of a mental state. So when we have this word afflictions, they're necessarily not perceiving, they're necessarily misperceptions or misconceptions, misconceptions.